first snowfall of December dusted the countryside as Miss Marple arrived at Blackthorn Inn, a charming yet forlorn establishment on the outskirts of Devonshire. Its once grand facade had faded, the ivy creeping up its stone walls now more menacing than picturesque. The inn, run by the shrewd yet weary Mrs. Alderton, was no longer a place of lively travellers, but of quiet lodgers with secrets to keep. Miss Marple, having been invited by her old friend Colonel Harrington for a peaceful winter retreat, found anything but tranquillity upon stepping inside. The warmth of the hearth barely reached the shadows of the dimly lit lobby, where guests sat in uneasy silence. The tension was palpable, and it took only a moment for Miss Marple's sharp gaze to catch the flickering glances and whispered conversations. Something had happened. When Mrs. Alderton spotted her, the woman exhaled in visible relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank heavens you've come." It was not the greeting she had expected. "Is there trouble, my dear?" she asked, her eyes soft but watchful. Mrs. Alderton led her away from prying ears and lowered her voice. "There's been a terrible incident. Mr. Redmayne, one of our guests, was found dead in his room this morning, locked from the inside. And there was something strange left behind." Miss Marple, ever composed, nodded. "Best show me at once." She was led upstairs, past worn carpets that muffled their footsteps, to room 7. Inspector Lionel Graves, a stout man, with a permanent scowl, stood by the door. His expression darkened further at the sight of her. "I suppose you'll want a look, Miss Marple?" She merely smiled. "If you don't mind, dear Inspector." With an exasperated sigh, he pushed the door open. The room was tidy, almost too tidy, no signs of struggle. The gas lamp flickered in the dim light, illuminating the lifeless form of Mr. Redmayne slumped over his writing desk. His face was pale, lips slightly parted, as if surprised. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent. No wounds, no blood. A half-written letter lay under his limp hand, the ink dried mid-word. And then there was the clue. On the floor beside the desk lay a crimson-coloured feather. Miss Marple frowned. "Unusual," Inspector Graves huffed. "Unusual? It's absurd. No birds like that around here." And the door was locked from inside. The window, latched. No sign of poison in his glass. It's an impossible crime. She knelt beside the body, inspecting the letter. The unfinished sentence intrigued her. "I have discovered the truth and—" The ink trailed off. The man had been in the middle of exposing something. But what? Her eyes shifted to the feather. "Tell me, Inspector, was this here when you entered?" Graves grumbled. "A maid found him this morning. Said she saw the feather near the body but didn't touch a thing. And before you ask, yes, I had the door forced open myself. We're looking for this crimson bird, but it's nonsense." Miss Marple tapped her chin. "Not nonsense, Inspector, a misdirection." She surveyed the room again, her eyes taking in the details. The undisturbed furniture, the neatly arranged papers, the lack of any signs of distress. Mr. Redmayne had not struggled, which meant death had come swiftly and without warning. But the locked door suggested intent. Someone had staged the scene carefully. "Who was he?" she asked at last. Mrs. Alderton answered. "A journalist. Came here to rest, or so he claimed." She hesitated, then added, "But he was asking questions about some of the guests. I told him not to stir trouble." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Then we must consider who had something to hide." The guests were gathered in the parlour, a collection of wary faces watching the crackling fire rather than each other. There was Mr. Godfrey, the retired judge, with a gaze like a hawk, Miss Langley, the quiet young woman who read poetry by the window, Dr. Bellamy, a physician whose hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, and Mr. Ashton, a traveller who claimed no particular destination. Miss Marple noted their reactions as the news of Redmayne's death was reiterated. Some gasped, some feigned shock. But one person's response stood out. Miss Langley's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the hem of her dress at the mention of the crimson feather. Noticing Miss Marple's keen interest, Inspector Graves crossed his arms. "Do you see something I don't?" she smiled. "Only the threads of a puzzle waiting to be unravelled." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Miss Langley for only a fraction longer than necessary, just enough to see the slight shift in her expression, the way her eyes darted toward the others before quickly returning to the fire. A reaction too controlled, too measured. But Miss Marple, knowing the power of silence, said nothing. Instead, she turned her attention back to Inspector Graves, who was growing impatient. "I suppose you'll be telling me next that the feather means something," he grumbled. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag clutched primly in her hands. "Oh, Inspector, everything means something." She let her eyes sweep across the parlour once more, catching the way Mr. Ashton, the supposed traveller, had positioned himself slightly apart from the others, close enough to appear engaged, but distant enough to avoid conversation. Dr. Bellamy, the physician, was fidgeting with his pocket watch, his fingers tapping nervously against the case. And Judge Godfrey, ever watchful, sat rigid, his expression betraying nothing but his fingers gripping the arm of his chair just a little too tightly. Miss Marple's attention returned to Miss Langley, who had begun twisting the corner of her scarf between her fingers. Such small things, but oh, how revealing they were. Before anyone could break the silence, a sudden knock at the front door startled the room. The butler, a gaunt man with a weary gait, hurried to answer it. A gust of winter air swept into the hall as the door creaked open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy overcoat. He removed his hat, shaking the snow from its brim, before stepping inside. His sharp eyes immediately took in the room, landing on Inspector Graves with the precision of a man used to reading people quickly. "Ah, Graves," the newcomer said. "I was passing through when I heard there'd been some trouble. Thought I might lend a hand." Inspector Graves scowled but did not refuse. "Inspector Finch, didn't think you'd bother yourself with something like this?" Finch shrugged. Off his coat, his movements methodical. A locked room death. Odd clue left behind. Can't resist a bit of a challenge. His gaze flicked toward Miss Marple, and a knowing glint flashed in his eyes. "And I see we have another keen observer in our midst." Miss Marple inclined, her head politely. "Jane Marple, just an old lady with an interest in the peculiar." Finch gave a small smile, but his focus quickly returned to business. "Tell me, Graves, what have we got?" The inspector gave a curt summary of the facts: the locked door, the missing cause of death, the unfinished letter, and, of course, the crimson feather. Finch listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When Graves finished, Finch's sharp gaze swept over the guests. "Mr. Redmayne was a journalist," he said thoughtfully. "Journalists tend to make enemies, especially if they start asking the wrong questions." His words settled over the room like a weight, pressing against each guest in turn. Miss Marple, meanwhile, watched Finch with interest. He had the air of a man who saw the world in stark lines, fitting each piece neatly into place. A fine mind, but not one for the delicate nuances of human nature. "Tell me, Miss Marple," Finch said, his tone light but probing, "do you think the feather was meant to mislead us?" She smiled. "Why, yes, Inspector, and very cleverly too. It is such an unusual thing that one cannot help but focus on it. A fine distraction." Finch nodded approvingly. "Then the real clue must be something else. Something we've overlooked." Miss Marple's fingers traced the handle of her knitting bag as she considered. Then, with a small sigh, she said, "The body." Graves scoffed. "We've examined the body." "Oh, I am sure you have, dear Inspector," she said kindly. "But did you happen to check his shoes?" A beat of silence. Finch turned on his heel and strode toward the stairs, Graves grumbling after him. Miss Marple followed at her usual unhurried pace, already knowing what they would find. The room was just as they had left it, save for the unsettling stillness that only a death can bring. Finch crouched beside the body, studying the polished leather shoes peeking from beneath Redmayne's trousers. He frowned, then carefully lifted one foot, tilting it toward the light. A smear of damp earth clung to the sole. Graves straightened. "That's odd. The grounds are frozen solid." Finch's frown deepened. "Which means he must have stepped in fresh earth somewhere. But where?" Miss Marple ever so gently cleared her throat. "I believe the answer lies in the greenhouse." The two inspectors turned to her. "The greenhouse?" Finch repeated. She nodded. "You see, I took a small stroll upon my arrival and noticed something rather peculiar. The door to the greenhouse was slightly ajar, and there were footprints, faint but visible, leading toward it. I thought little of it then, but now it seems quite important, doesn't it?" Finch wasted no time. "Come on, Graves." The two men hurried downstairs, Miss Marple following at her own pace. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, their breath curling in the cold. The greenhouse, set slightly apart from the inn, loomed ahead, its glass panes glistening in the moonlight. Finch reached the door first. He pushed it open, and the heavy scent of damp soil and foliage greeted them. The ground inside was uneven, disturbed. A single overturned pot lay near the center, and just beside it, half buried in the soil, was something glinting under the weak light. Finch crouched and pulled it free. A gold cufflink. Miss Marple peered at it. An expensive item to lose. Finch turned it over, his eyes narrowing at the small engraving on the back. A monogram J.G. Graves exhaled sharply. "Judge Godfrey." Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "Oh dear, how very interesting." Inspector Finch turned the cufflink over in his gloved fingers, the engraved initials catching the dim light from the greenhouse lanterns. The silence between him, Graves, and Miss Marple stretched, broken only by the occasional creak of the old glass panes shifting in the cold. "Judge Godfrey," Graves muttered, rubbing a hand over his chin. "It could belong to someone else, surely." Finch shot him a sharp look. "A monogrammed cufflink doesn't change hands easily, and it was buried, as if someone meant to hide it." He turned to Miss Marple. "You've been watching them. What do you make of him?" She smiled, as though she had been asked about a particularly interesting knitting pattern, rather than a potential suspect. "Judge Godfrey is a man who believes in order, a man who dislikes disruption. But most importantly, he is a man who watches everything except perhaps himself." Graves let out a long breath. "Best we speak with him, then." They returned to the inn, the warmth inside doing little to ease the tension settling over the gathered guests. Judge Godfrey had not moved from his chair by the fire, his sharp eyes following them as they entered. He saw the cufflink before. It was even presented, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, a movement so small that only Miss Marple seemed to notice. Finch held the cufflink up. "This was found in the greenhouse. Your initials." The judge did not blink. "Indeed, it is mine." Graves frowned. "You admit it just like that?" "Why wouldn't I?" Judge Godfrey's voice was measured, steady. "I must have lost it at some point." "In the greenhouse?" Finch pressed. The judge hesitated, but only briefly. "I walked through the greenhouse last night. I find it rather soothing." Graves exchanged a glance with Finch. "Rather late for a stroll, wasn't it?" A slight shrug. "I often have trouble sleeping. Fresh air helps." Miss Marple, seated quietly nearby, spoke for the first time. "Did you happen to see Mr. Redmayne while you were there?" For the first time, the judge's composure wavered. It was brief, a flicker in the depths of his expression, but it was there. "No," he said. Finch studied him. "And yet we found Redmayne's shoes dirtied with fresh soil. He was there." Silence. Then a slow exhale. "Very well. Yes. I saw him." Graves leaned forward. "Doing what?" Judge Godfrey's fingers tapped against the arm of his chair. "He was searching for something, digging, I believe. I confronted him, asked what he was doing. He told me it was none of my business." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did you leave it at that?" "I did." Finch's voice was firm. "And when was the last time you saw him?" The judge's gaze did not waver. "That was the last time." A moment passed before Finch nodded, as if deciding to let the silence work on the judge a little longer. Then, turning to Graves, he said, "Let's hear what the others have to say." The guests were questioned one by one. Mr. Ashton, the traveller, leaned against the mantelpiece, his arms crossed. "Redmayne and I spoke briefly last night. He was in a mood, thought he was onto something important." "What kind of something?" Finch asked. Ashton shrugged. "Didn't say. Just muttered about the truth coming out soon." "Did he mention anyone specifically?" A pause, then a shake of the head. "No." Finch let the silence settle before shifting his focus to Miss Langley, who sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. "Miss Langley, did you see Redmayne last night?" She swallowed. "No, I was in my room." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And yet, when we first mentioned the feather, you reacted. Why?" Her fingers curled slightly. I was surprised, that's all." Miss Marple, ever so gently, said, "My dear, surprise often looks very different from fear." Miss Langley's lips parted, as if to protest, but then she looked down. I found a feather like that before, in my room, a few nights ago." Finch and Graves exchanged a glance. "Why didn't you say anything?" Finch asked. She hesitated. "Because I thought it was a prank." "By whom?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Graves let out a frustrated breath. "And you don't think it's rather strange that the same kind of feather turns up next to a dead man?" Miss Langley was silent. Miss Marple observed her carefully, then shifted her attention to Dr. Bellamy, who had been watching the questioning with an expression bordering on unease. "Dr. Bellamy," she said, her voice gentle but pointed, "surely you must have some insight into what might have caused Mr. Redmayne's death. The physician flinched at the sudden attention. Well, I examined him briefly, but with no obvious wounds or signs of struggle, I cannot say definitively. Finch's sharp gaze landed on him. And yet, you seem rather nervous. Bellamy's fingers tightened around his pocket watch. This is a troubling situation. A man is dead. I'd think it would make anyone uneasy. Miss Marple studied him. That is certainly true, but fear and guilt wear different faces, don't they? Bellamy's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Before Finch could press further, the butler entered, his face pale. "Sirs, madam," he said, his voice trembling, "you may wish to see this." They followed him down the hall. He stopped outside a narrow supply closet, the door slightly ajar. With a nervous glance at them, he pushed it open wider. Inside, amidst the neatly arranged linens and cleaning supplies, lay another crimson feather. And beneath it, tucked away behind a stack of folded towels, was a small leather notebook with the initials C.R. embossed on the cover. Finch picked it up, flipping through the pages. His face darkened. This belonged to Redmayne. Miss Marple, peering over his shoulder, read the last entry. "I know what happened at Blackthorn. I have the proof now. I only need to decide what to do with it." Finch exhaled slowly. It seems Redmayne was writing his own death sentence. Miss Marple pressed a gloved hand against the fabric of her bag, thoughtful. Or perhaps, dear Inspector, he was writing someone else's. Inspector Finch ran a gloved hand over the cover of Redmayne's notebook, his expression hard. The weight of the small leather-bound journal was deceptive. It contained secrets, that much was certain. Miss Marple, ever so patient, watched as he flipped carefully through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. Beside him, Graves leaned in, frowning. "He's vague," Finch muttered. "No names, no specifics, just hints. The truth about Blackthorn. A secret buried too deep. Someone watching me." He knew he was in danger. Miss Marple clasped her hands. And yet he stayed. Graves snorted. "Journalists. They never know when to walk away." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the fireplace, where the other guests remained, each feigning a level of disinterest that was entirely too calculated. Judge Godfrey had resumed his stiff composure, though his hands no longer gripped the chair's arms quite as tightly. Miss Langley had paled further, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Mr. Ashton kept his distance, fingers tapping against his glass as though deep in thought. Dr. Bellamy sat unnaturally still, his pocket watch resting on his knee unopened. "It seems," Finch said, closing the notebook with a quiet snap, "that Mr. Redmayne had reason to believe something foul was going on here at Blackthorn." His gaze moved across the room. "Which means all of you are of interest." A murmur swept through the group, but no one spoke first. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, then said, "Perhaps we should consider what he could have been after. A journalist does not dig without reason, and people do not kill without cause." Graves exhaled sharply. "Plenty of causes here. Let's start with the obvious. Money. Redmayne might have uncovered something financially damning. Judge Godfrey, you've built a fine career. Could he have found something that might tarnish it?" The judge's glare was sharp enough to cut glass. "I have nothing to hide. And yet, your cufflink was buried in the greenhouse," Finch reminded him. The judge's jaw tightened. "A coincidence?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. Though coincidences are rather like knitting errors, once you notice one, you begin to see the whole pattern unravel. Graves smirked, but Finch pressed on. What about you, Mr. Ashton? A traveller, you say? But Redmayne took an interest in you, didn't he? Ashton exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down with deliberate care. Yes, he asked me questions, unpleasant ones, such as a slight pause. Then, my business, my connections. He seemed convinced I was hiding something. And were you? Ashton's lips curled. I have debts, Inspector. Nothing illegal, but not the sort of thing one advertises. If Redmayne had it in his mind to expose me, I wouldn't have appreciated it, but I wouldn't have killed him for it either. Debts can be motivating, Graves muttered. Not motivating enough to kill a man inside a locked room, Ashton countered. Miss Marple studied him, then turned her attention to Miss Langley, who had shrunk slightly into her chair. And you, my dear? You seemed quite unsettled by that feather. Miss Langley's breath hitched. I told you I found one before in my room. And yet, you did not seem merely surprised. You seemed frightened. Miss Langley hesitated. Then, in a whisper, I thought it was a warning. A warning? Finch pressed. She wrung her hands. Her gaze flickered to the others, lingering on Judge Godfrey before she looked away. I received a letter last week. No name, no signature, just a single line. Leave Blackthorn before it's too late. The air in the room shifted. Graves let out a low whistle. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? Miss Langley's voice was barely audible. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Finch asked. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Dr. Bellamy. The doctor, who had been silent thus far, finally spoke, his voice calm but deliberate. I believe we should all be quite honest now, shouldn't we? Finch's eyes narrowed. Go on. Bellamy set his pocket watch down. Mr. Redmayne wasn't just investigating one of us, he was investigating all of us. The silence was deafening. Miss Marple, ever composed, nodded. And what exactly did he uncover, Doctor? Bellamy let out a slow breath. It seems Redmayne had discovered something unfortunate about this inn. Something that connects us all in ways we would rather forget. Finch leaned forward. And that is? The doctor's gaze was steady. A death. Even Miss Marple seemed to pause at that. A death? Finch repeated. Bellamy nodded. Years ago, a woman, Catherine Redmayne, his sister. Graves cursed under his breath. Finch exhaled, rubbing his jaw. And let me guess, she died here at Blackthorn. More than that, Miss Marple said softly. She was murdered here. Bellamy gave a grim nod. And we were all here when it happened. The revelation landed like a hammer, heavy and undeniable. Well, Miss Marple murmured, looking around at the now deeply unsettled room, that does rather tangle the motives, doesn't it? The revelation hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the room with unspoken tension. Catherine Redmayne, murdered here at Blackthorn Inn. Every person present had been there when it happened, and now her brother had met the same fate. Finch took a measured breath. If Redmayne came here for revenge, it stands to reason that he found his answer before he died. Judge Godfrey's voice was tight. You assume too much, Inspector. Finch's sharp gaze locked onto him. Do I? You were all here when Catherine Redmayne was murdered. Redmayne came sniffing around looking for the truth. And now he's dead. That's not assumption, Judge. That's pattern. The judge's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Graves, pacing near the fire, muttered, "We need something concrete, a connection between Catherine's murder and Redmayne's." Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting resting on her lap, finally spoke. "We already have a connection, the Crimson Feather." A hush fell over the room. Finch's brow furrowed. "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands. "It's not the sort of thing one finds lying about, is it? And yet, one appeared near Mr. Redmayne's body, and another in Miss Langley's room." Graves scoffed. "So? It could be a calling card, a message meant to unnerve." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Or it could be a signature." A slow, uneasy realization settled over them. Finch turned abruptly to Bellamy. "You were here when Catherine was killed. How did she die?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "She was found in her room, poisoned." Miss Langley let out a small gasp, and Ashton muttered a curse under his breath. Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. "And was there a crimson feather found near her by any chance?" Bellamy stiffened. "Yes, there was." A long silence stretched between them. Finch nodded grimly. "Then that settles it. Redmayne found his sister's killer." The tension in the room reached its peak when a sudden noise came from the hallway, a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. The butler, still pale from his earlier discovery, moved swiftly to answer. A constable stood in the entrance, cap tucked under one arm. He hesitated only briefly before stepping inside, his eyes scanning the assembled group before settling on Finch. "Sir, we found this hidden in the deceased's room." He handed Finch a small, crumpled scrap of paper. Finch unfolded it, his eyes scanning the hurried writing. His jaw clenched. Graves peered over his shoulder. "What's it say?" Finch read it aloud. "I know who killed Catherine. I have the proof. If anything happens to me, look to—" The writing stopped abruptly, as if Redmayne had been interrupted before he could finish. Graves let out a low whistle. Damn. He got close. Too close. Finch turned to the group. "This is enough for me. Someone here silenced Redmayne before he could speak. We may not have a name, but we have intent." His eyes landed on Judge Godfrey. "And we have a suspect." Godfrey's face darkened. "You overstep, Inspector." Finch ignored him. "Graves, bring him in." The constable moved forward, Graves at his side. The judge did not resist, merely rising from his chair with slow dignity. His voice was level but cold. "You are making a grave mistake." "We'll see about that," Finch said, leading him out. The rest of the room remained in stunned silence. Bellamy looked away, Ashton reached for his drink, and Miss Langley swallowed hard, eyes flickering toward Miss Marple, who had not moved. After a long moment, she sighed. "That won't be the end of it." Graves, still watching the door, frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together softly. "It's all rather convenient, isn't it? A note, conveniently unfinished. A feather. A judge with a temper." She shook her head. "No, dear. The real criminal is far cleverer than that." Finch returned, rubbing his temple. "The judge won't speak, but the magistrate will take it from here. We have motive. We have a connection. To Catherine, that's good enough for them." Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic smile. "But not for you." He sighed. "No, Something feels wrong. Too easy. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with quiet understanding. Because it is. And somewhere beyond the walls of Blackthorn Inn, hidden in the shadows, the real murderer was watching. Waiting. Ready to strike again. The evening deepened around Blackthorn Inn, the cold creeping in through the edges of the old windows as if the house itself conspired to keep its secrets. The judge was gone, taken into custody, and yet the air inside remained thick with something unresolved. Finch stood by the hearth, his brow furrowed, as Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands resting atop her folded knitting. Graves had retreated to the sideboard, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy, while the remaining guests nursed their own private thoughts, each one more restless than before. Miss Marple broke the silence. "We are all terribly relieved, aren't we?" Graves turned, glass in hand. "You don't sound relieved." Her smile was gentle but unwavering. "Because I do not believe it is over," Finch exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Go on." She tapped her fingers lightly against the arm of her chair. "The feather. It appears in Catherine's murder, and now in Redmayne's. But why? If the judge were the killer, why would he repeat the exact same mark after all these years?" "It does not make sense," Graves frowned. "To make a statement, or to mislead," Miss Marple countered. Finch's eyes sharpened. "You think it's deliberate?" "Of course. It's far too neat." She paused, then continued. "And consider the note. If Redmayne truly had the proof, why leave it so exposed? He was a journalist. Surely he would have been more careful." Graves let out a breath. "So what are we missing?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Something buried in the past." A sudden rustle from the doorway drew their attention. Miss Langley stood there, her hands clasped, face pale. I think I might know something." Finch turned to her. "Speak plainly, Miss Langley." She swallowed hard. "I didn't tell you everything about Catherine Redmayne." Graves muttered, "Of course you didn't." She ignored him, continuing in a halting voice. "Catherine wasn't just some passing guest at Blackthorn. She worked here." Silence followed. Finch straightened. "She was staff?" Langley nodded. "A housemaid. Not long before she died, she was dismissed." Graves whistled softly. "So Redmayne wasn't just looking for a murderer. He was looking for someone who wronged his sister long before she died." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Why was she dismissed?" Langley hesitated. "There were rumors that she knew something about one of the guests." Finch's mind was already racing. "And no one thought to mention this?" Langley shivered. "It was so long ago, and besides, she wasn't the only one." Finch's eyes narrowed. "The only one what?" Langley bit her lip. "She wasn't the only housemaid to disappear." The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Disappeared, you say?" Langley nodded. "There were others. Not murdered, not publicly, but they left. Suddenly, without a word. No one ever spoke of it." Finch exchanged a glance with Graves. "And you think this is connected?" Langley's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think Catherine found out why." A long silence followed. Then Finch muttered, "Damn it all, Miss." Marple exhaled softly. "It isn't just about Catherine, is it? It never was." Graves rubbed a hand over his face. "So what now? You think someone at Blackthorn was getting rid of housemaids?" Miss Marple's voice was steady. Not housemaids, witnesses. A sudden tension filled the room. Finch turned abruptly to Langley. Who was staying here when Catherine worked at the inn? She hesitated, then rattled off a list. Judge Godfrey, Dr. Bellamy, Ashton, and... She trailed off, visibly struggling. Miss Marple prompted gently. And? Langley swallowed. And someone else, a man I never met, but the staff always spoke in hushed tones when they mentioned him. A businessman of sorts. Came and went irregularly. I don't even know his name. Finch frowned. No records. Langley shook her head. None I ever saw. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the fire, where shadows flickered and danced against the walls. Then that is where we must look, not just at the guests, but at those who were forgotten. Graves exhaled sharply. So we're chasing ghosts now. Finch gave him a hard look. Not ghosts. The past. And the past, my friend, always leaves a trace. The room was silent. Once more, but this time it was not the silence of tension. It was the silence of a mystery beginning to unravel thread by thread. The wind howled outside Blackthorn Inn, rattling the old window panes as if some unseen force urged them to hurry. Inside, the air was thick with thought. The fire crackled, low in the hearth, casting restless shadows across the faces of those still gathered. Finch sat forward, fingers laced, his mind racing through everything Miss Langley had just revealed. Graves paced near the window, hands in his pockets, while Miss Marple remained still, her gaze distant but sharp, as if reaching into the past itself. A businessman? Finch murmured, mostly to himself. No records, no name. Graves grunted. Could be anyone. Could be no one. Miss Marple finally stirred. Not no one, she said softly. Someone important enough to remain unseen. Finch turned to Langley. Are you certain there are no records? Guest logs, letters, anything? Langley shook her head. If there were, they'd be in the old ledgers, the ones Mr. Harrow kept locked away. Finch's eyes narrowed. Harrow? She hesitated. The old manager. He ran the inn before Mr. Clifford. He was very particular about records, but he passed away years ago. Finch let out a breath. And where are these ledgers now? Langley hesitated, then said, In the attic. A collective sigh filled the room. Graves, ever the skeptic, muttered, Convenient. Miss Marple only smiled. Quite. The group made their way through the dimly lit halls, the weight of history pressing down on them with each step. The attic door groaned as Finch forced it open, revealing a narrow staircase that led up into the gloom. Dust thickened the air. As they entered, the smell of aged paper and forgotten secrets clinging to the wooden beams. Langley pointed to a battered chest in the corner. If they're anywhere, they'll be in there. Graves knelt, undoing the latches with a grunt. The lid creaked open, revealing stacks of old, leather-bound ledgers. Finch flipped through them quickly, searching for the right dates. Then, suddenly he stopped. Here, he muttered, pulling out a worn, yellowed page. These are the guests who stayed here the year Catherine Redmayne was dismissed. Miss Marple leaned in. Well? Finch's eyes scanned the names, his brow furrowing. Judge Godfrey, Dr. Bellamy, Ashton, and then... He frowned. This doesn't make sense. Graves peered over his shoulder. What? There's no unknown businessman listed, no gaps, no missing entries. Finch's fingers traced the ink. Then he exhaled sharply. But there is something strange. One name appears 3 times, on 3 separate stays. He turned the page so the others could see. Mr. Henry Baxter Langley let out a small gasp. That's him! Finch's jaw tightened. Henry Baxter, that name ring any bells? Graves? Shook his head. Miss Marple, however, smiled. Oh, Inspector, you do have a way of missing the obvious, don't you? Finch frowned. Explain. She tapped the ledger with one finger. Henry Baxter wasn't a guest. He was an alias. The realization hit them all at once. Finch let out a low curse. Then someone here was hiding under a false name. Graves's voice was tight. Which means the real criminal has been standing in front of us all along. Finch shut the ledger with a snap. Then we need a way to flush them out. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I might have an idea. The guests were summoned back to the sitting room, a growing unease settling over the group. The storm outside had worsened, the wind pressing against the old walls of Blackthorn Inn. The fire flickered, long shadows stretching across the floor. Finch stood at the center, arms crossed. We have new information, he announced. A name, Henry Baxter. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Dr. Bellamy frowned. Who is that? Miss Marple's smile remained serene. That is what we would like to know. Finch stepped forward, gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. This name appeared in the inn's ledgers, connected to the same time period when Catherine Redmayne was here. We believe it to be an alias, which means the real murderer, the person who has been hiding in plain sight, is someone standing in this room. Tension thickened. Bellamy looked to Ashton. Ashton looked to Langley. Langley swallowed hard. Then Finch added, "And we have proof." The air went still. Graves, standing near the doorway, chimed in. It was careless, really. A mistake anyone could make. Miss Marple nodded. But mistakes, as we know, are how the truth is uncovered. There was a long silence. Then Bellamy scoffed. If you have proof, then present it. Finch smiled. Oh, we will. Miss Marple gestured toward the sideboard. But first, a drink, I think, to steady our nerves. Graves moved to pour, hand steady as he set down the glasses. But when he reached for the decanter, he hesitated. Oh, my mistake. This one has a rather distinct scent. He lifted the crystal stopper, inhaled deeply, then turned, offering it to the room. Would anyone care to smell? Miss Langley shook her head. Ashton leaned away. Bellamy narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Finch, watching closely, murmured, Miss Marple, you have quite the keen sense of smell. What does this remind you of? She took the stopper delicately, breathed in, then smiled. Bitter almonds. Another silence. Then, all at once, Bellamy paled. Graves saw it first, the slight recoil, the tightening of his fingers, the subtle, involuntary reaction of someone who recognized something they shouldn't have. Finch's voice was quiet but sharp. Dr. Bellamy, you look unwell. Bellamy opened his mouth, but no words came out. Miss Marple placed the stopper down gently. Cyanide. A strangled sound escaped Bellamy's throat. This is absurd. Is it? Finch cut in. Catherine Redmayne was poisoned. Cyanide, we believe. And now Redmayne's brother is dead. And here, in this very room, is a decanter with traces of the same. Bellamy's hands curled into fists. You can't possibly... Finch stepped closer. You were here all those years ago under a false name. You knew Catherine. And you knew what she had discovered. Bellamy's jaw clenched. This is preposterous. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You were the unknown. Businessman, weren't you? The room was deathly silent. Then, finally, Bellamy exhaled. A slow, measured breath. His eyes darkened, shoulders tightening as if bracing against an unseen weight. And for the first time that evening, he said nothing at all. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackling fire and the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Bellamy's face remained impassive, but the weight of the accusation hung over him like a guillotine waiting to fall. Finch studied him closely, noting the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair just a little too tightly. A man preparing for battle or surrender. It was hard to tell which. We'll need to search his belongings, Graves said gruffly, breaking the moment. If he's been hiding something, it won't stay hidden much longer. Bellamy let out a slow breath, then stood. I have nothing to hide, he said coolly, straightening his cuffs. By all means, conduct your little search. Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, but she folded her hands neatly in her lap, watching him as one might watch a chess opponent in the final moves of a long and patient game. You're very composed for a man accused of murder, Doctor. Bellamy met her gaze, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. In my line of work, composure is everything. Without another word, Graves led the way toward Bellamy's quarters, Finch and Langley following close behind. The corridor was eerily quiet, the echoes of their footsteps swallowed by the heavy wooden beams overhead. When they reached the doctor's room, Finch wasted no time, methodically searching through the contents of the drawers, the wardrobe, the small travel case at the foot of the bed. Graves ran a hand over the dresser, lifting a silver pocket watch before setting it back down. Nothing out of the ordinary. Langley hesitated by the window. What exactly are we looking for? Finch didn't answer right away. He turned toward the desk, eyeing a stack of papers, a medical bag resting beside it. Carefully, he unfastened the latch and peered inside. Standard equipment, he murmured, pulling out a few glass vials, small instruments, neatly labeled bottles. He froze. The bottle in his hand was empty, but a faint residue clung to the inside, a pale, almost imperceptible dusting of white against the dark glass. Finch's stomach tightened. He turned the bottle toward the light, angling it carefully. Cyanide, he said under his breath. Graves stepped closer. Are you certain? Finch exhaled sharply. Enough for a test if we get it back to the lab. But as he reached for his handkerchief to wrap it, a sound made him pause. A soft creak, the faintest shift in the floorboards just beyond the doorway. Langley turned sharply. Did you hear that? Graves was already moving, yanking open the door. But the hallway beyond was empty. The shadows stretched long and deep, the air still heavy with the storm raging outside. A moment passed, then another. No one. Graves muttered. Finch's grip on the vial tightened. He wasn't so sure. The tension in the inn was palpable. Word of Bellamy's possible involvement had spread in hushed whispers, weaving through the walls like an unseen force. Finch kept the bottle in his pocket, unwilling to leave it unattended for even a moment. They would lock it in the study safe, overnight just to be certain. Miss Marple, however, remained oddly quiet. She watched everything, listened even when it seemed she wasn't paying attention. At dinner she noted the subtle shifts. The way Bellamy kept his movements precise, controlled. his gaze flicking toward Finch's pocket when he thought no one was looking. The way Ashton avoided meeting anyone's eye, the nervous way Miss Langley twisted her hands in her lap. Someone here was growing desperate. Later that night, as the storm raged on, Finch and Graves returned to the study to lock away the evidence. The old safe sat embedded in the wall, its iron door heavy and unyielding. Finch placed the bottle inside, along with the ledgers they had recovered from the attic. "Only you and I know the combination," Finch said. Graves grunted. "And I don't forget things." Finch exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Then let's hope this is enough to keep it safe." But safety was an illusion. Morning came with a violent gust of wind rattling the windows, and with it, chaos. Finch awoke to Graves pounding on his door, his expression dark. "It's gone." For a moment, Finch thought he was still dreaming. "What?" "The vial. The evidence. Someone got into the safe." Finch was on his feet in an instant, barely bothering to throw on his coat before following Graves down the hall. When they reached the study, his stomach dropped. The safe door stood ajar. Inside, the ledgers remained untouched, but the vial, the one thing they needed, was gone. Langley appeared in the doorway, a hand covering her mouth. But how? Miss Marple stepped forward, running a delicate hand over the open safe. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it. No forced entry. Graves let out a slow, deliberate breath. Then someone knew the combination. The room fell into silence. Finch's mind raced. Only he and Graves had the code. And yet, someone had managed to get in, to remove the one piece of undeniable proof they had. Miss Marple turned toward them, her expression unreadable. Either the safe was opened, or the evidence was taken before it was ever placed inside. Langley's breath hitched. "You mean—" Miss Marple nodded. "I mean, my dear, that someone was one step ahead of us all along." A sickening realization settled over them. Somewhere in the inn, the real culprit was growing bolder, more desperate. And if they were willing to risk this much to cover their tracks, then the danger wasn't just in what had already happened, it was in what was coming next. The storm outside had calmed to a sullen drizzle, but inside Blackthorn Inn, the tension only deepened. The missing vial had shaken everyone. Someone had taken a desperate risk to cover their tracks, and the fact that there was no forced entry suggested one chilling truth. The culprit was among them, hiding behind a careful mask, waiting for the next move. Miss Marple sat by the fire in the study, hands folded neatly in her lap. Finch paced restlessly, while Graves stood by the open safe, his jaw tight. Langley hovered near the doorway, her fingers twitching against her skirts. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "That vial was the one thing we had. Now it's gone." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "If it was stolen, my dear, it means someone believed it was dangerous to them, which suggests they know far more than they are letting on." Graves exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "Only Finch and I knew the combination. Either someone forced it out of us or—" He trailed off, glancing warily at Finch. Finch scowled. "Oh, don't start. You know as well as I do that I wouldn't be fool enough to remove the one thing that could solve this case." A heavy silence settled over them, then a scream shattered it. Langley gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Finch was already moving, pushing past her into the hallway. Miss Marple rose swiftly, following with measured urgency. The cry had come from the far end of the corridor, near the grand staircase. Finch reached the landing just as Bellamy emerged from his quarters, his expression drawn. Miss Ashton stood frozen, her face pale as she pointed down the stairs. "There," she stammered. It's him." At the foot of the stairs, half hidden, in the dim glow of the oil lamp, lay a crumpled figure. His dark suit was soaked from the rain that had blown in through an open side door, his face turned at an unnatural angle. Graves cursed under his breath. Dr. Bellamy descended first, kneeling beside the body. His expression, ever composed, darkened as he reached for the man's wrist, searching for a pulse. But they all knew even before he shook his head. "It's over," he murmured. "He's dead." Finch's stomach twisted as he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as recognition struck him like a hammer blow. The dead man was Clive Radley, the very same constable who had first arrived to investigate Harrington's death. Miss Marple, now beside Finch, regarded the scene with an almost unsettling calm. "How very interesting," she murmured. Langley, pale as a ghost, clutched her, shawl tightly. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "Why would anyone kill him?" Graves's expression was grim. Maybe he saw something, knew too much. Finch crouched beside Bellamy, inspecting the body. Radley's coat was damp from the rain, but something else caught his eye. A smear of mud on his fingers, as though he'd been grasping at something. His expression darkened as he noticed a scrap of paper half tucked into his breast pocket. Carefully, he withdrew it and unfolded the damp sheet. A single word was scrawled in hurried, uneven script. Blackthorn. Finch exchanged a look with Miss Marple. "Was he trying to tell us something?" The old woman studied the note, then glanced toward the open side door. "I do believe Mr. Radley intended to deliver a warning," she said. "But I fear he was silenced before he could do so." Bellamy rose smoothly, brushing off his coat. "And yet, we are no closer to discovering who the murderer is." His tone was measured, but something about the way he said it made Finch's skin prickle. Graves grunted. "We're not finished yet." The group moved the body from the stairs, but the inn felt even heavier with death than before. The candlelight flickered, the walls seeming to press in around them. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the fire, eyes half-lidded in thought. "Two murders," she murmured. One carefully staged, the other rushed, desperate. The first was meant to mislead us. The second, that was an act of necessity. Langley frowned. Necessity, Finch exhaled. Meaning Radley must have found something, or someone, and was killed to keep him quiet. Miss Marple nodded. "Which means we are very close, indeed." But close was not the same as safe. As the night stretched on, the sense of unease deepened. Someone had struck again, proving that they were not only among them, but that they were willing to kill again to stay ahead. The game had changed, and Miss Marple knew without a shadow of a doubt that the next move would be the most dangerous of all. The night pressed heavily upon Blackthorn Inn, the low hum of the rain outside a distant murmur against the crackling fire. The guests had withdrawn, their nerves frayed after Radley's murder, but Miss Marple sat unmoving in the study, eyes half closed, fingers laced gently in her lap. Finch and Graves, deep in their own brooding silences, stood nearby, their gazes fixed on the dying embers. "What bothers me," Graves muttered at last, breaking the silence, "is how Radley even got inside. The front door was bolted, and there's no sign of forced entry through the side passage. Miss Marple stirred. Not forced, perhaps, but invited. Finch frowned. You think he knew his killer? I think, my dear, that we have overlooked something very simple, she replied. Someone had access to that side door. Someone knew he was coming. Langley, who had returned moments ago with a fresh pot of tea, set it down carefully before shaking her head. But why would Radley come back? The case was already in the hands of the inspector. What did he discover that made him risk his life to warn us? Miss Marple accepted a cup with a nod of thanks, but did not answer immediately. Instead, she gazed thoughtfully at the flames, as though seeing something the others could not. There is a pattern, she murmured at last. A most peculiar one hidden in plain sight. Graves exhaled sharply. Enlighten us, then. She gave a small smile, but there was steel in it. Consider, for a moment, the three most telling things about this case: a stolen vial, a murdered constable, and an open door. Finch shook his head. And how do they connect? The vial disappeared because it held evidence too dangerous to remain, she said. Radley was killed because he knew something, and the open door... She paused, then continued, voice measured. That was not an accident. Langley shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. I mean, dear child, that it was meant to be found. Finch's brows drew together. But wouldn't the killer want to cover their tracks? Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea before setting the cup down gently. Not if they wanted to control the way we viewed the crime. Silence settled over the room, heavy with understanding. It was Graves who finally spoke, his voice low. You're saying this was deliberate? A calculated move? She nodded. A most clever one, too. The first murder, Harrington's, was designed to look like a locked-room puzzle. That distracted us, and then, just as we started to make sense of things, the vial vanished, throwing us off once again. And now, Radley's death, so crude, so rushed, was meant to push us toward a false conclusion. Finch straightened. Which means the real answer is buried underneath all of that misdirection. Precisely. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the rain-slicked window. And I do believe I know where to start digging. A rustling noise from the hallway made them all turn. Langley, nearest the door, stepped hesitantly into the corridor. Hello? No answer. Only the echo of the storm outside. Graves moved toward the doorway, his hand resting lightly on his revolver. Someone's listening, he muttered. A sudden creak, floorboards shifting under weight, sent Finch lunging toward the stairs. He caught the briefest glimpse of movement, the hem of a dark coat disappearing around the corner. Without hesitation, he gave chase. Miss Marple, ever composed, merely watched as he disappeared up the stairs. Then, turning back to Graves, she gave a knowing smile. Well, my dear Inspector, I do believe we are close to finding our fox in the henhouse. The sound of Finch's hurried footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors of Blackthorn Inn, his breath coming fast as he rounded the dimly lit staircase. He caught the briefest glimpse of movement at the far end of the hallway, a shadow slipping through a door. The guest rooms. Whoever had been listening in was desperate to remain unseen. He reached the door and pressed his palm against it, unlocked. With measured caution, he pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. It was empty, or at least appeared to be. Behind him, the others arrived. Graves entered first, revolver drawn, followed by Langley, pale but determined. Then came Miss Marple, ever composed, her gaze scanning the room with quiet scrutiny. "No one here," Finch muttered. Miss Marple's voice was soft but certain. "Not quite." Her eyes fell upon the wardrobe. A slight gap in the door, too. Still, too deliberate. Graves acted fast, flinging it open. A figure stumbled forward. Dr. Howard. His face was pale, his expression frozen in guilt. "Dr. Howard," Finch said evenly, "what exactly are you doing here?" The doctor exhaled, sharply straightening his coat with a shaking hand. "I heard voices. I was coming to see if everything was all right." Graves scoffed. "And you chose to hide in a wardrobe?" Howard's throat bobbed in a swallow. Miss Marple, calm and patient as ever, stepped forward. "Dr. Howard, lying does not suit you," she said gently. "And yet you've done it often these past few days, haven't you?" His gaze snapped to her, then darted toward the door as though calculating an escape, but there was nowhere to go. "First about the missing vial," she continued. "You insisted you had no knowledge of its contents, yet you were the one who confirmed it belonged to Mr. Harrington." Howard's jaw tightened. "That's because it was in his possession when he—" "Oh, certainly, but what I find curious," Miss Marple interrupted, "is that you never once questioned what was inside. A doctor, ignoring a mysterious chemical? That struck me as most unusual." Howard hesitated. "And then there's Mr. Radley," she went on. "You were the last to see him alive, were you not?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "He came to me, but I didn't—" "You didn't kill him," Miss Marple finished for him. "No, I don't believe you did. But you do know why he was killed, don't you?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Howard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Then help us understand," Finch pressed. The doctor exhaled shakily. His face, usually so composed, crumbled into something haunted. "I never meant for it to go this far," he admitted. "None of this was supposed to happen, but Harrington, he knew, he found out." "Found out what?" Howard's voice dropped to a whisper. "About her." Langley took a step forward, her expression pinched. "Her?" Howard closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself. Then, in a voice filled with regret, he murmured, "Lillian Harrington." The name fell like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Graves narrowed his eyes. "His wife?" Howard let out a bitter laugh. "Not quite. She wasn't just his wife. She was his victim." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but Finch saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Harrington was a cruel man," Howard continued, voice heavy with old guilt. "He hid it well, but those who truly knew him, knew her, they saw it. Lillian was terrified of him, and one day she disappeared. Everyone assumed she'd left him, that she'd run away, but she didn't." His throat tightened. "She was taken." The air in the room seemed to shrink. Langley's voice was barely a breath. "You mean she was murdered?" Howard's silence was answer enough. Finch's stomach turned. "And you knew?" "I suspected," Howard admitted. "But I had no proof, and no one would have believed me against a man like Harrington." Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was steady. "But someone did find proof, didn't they?" Howard nodded. "Radley. He was nosing around the estate, digging into old records, and then he found it. A letter. From Lillian. A desperate, terrified letter. Never sent. It confirmed what we'd feared. She hadn't run away. She was trying to escape, but she never made it. Graves's expression darkened. And that was the real reason Harrington was killed. Howard's hands trembled. Yes, it was never about money or revenge. It was about secrets, about hiding what he did. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Then tell me, Doctor, who had the most to lose from this truth coming to light? Howard swallowed hard. Then, very quietly, he whispered, Eleanor Blackwood. The room seemed to tilt. Finch's breath caught. The widow. Howard's voice was hollow. She wasn't just Harrington's business partner. She was the one who helped cover it up. Miss Marple sat in the quiet drawing-room of Blackthorn Inn, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes on the large grandfather clock in the corner. The house had fallen into an uneasy stillness, though she sensed the weight of unseen movement beyond. The walls, the trap, was set. Now, all that remained was to watch the inevitable unfold. The others were positioned as planned, Finch in the study, Graves lingering near the entrance, and Langley hidden just out of sight. Dr. Howard had been sent to the dining hall, instructed to go about his evening as usual. There was no need to alert Eleanor Blackwood just yet. They had chosen the drawing-room deliberately. It was the only space in the inn where one could not see the front door from the windows, meaning if someone attempted to flee, they would have to pass directly through the corridor, where Finch and Graves were waiting. The clock struck 10. A soft creak sounded from the hallway. Miss Marple did not move, did not acknowledge the careful, measured footsteps approaching. She simply let her fingers trace the embroidery of her shawl, waiting. The figure who entered carried herself with the grace of someone accustomed to being in control. Eleanor Blackwood, poised as ever, barely hesitated before stepping fully into the room. But her gloved fingers tightened around the folds of her dress when she saw Miss Marple alone. "Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple greeted, her voice warm, inviting. "Do sit down, won't you?" Eleanor's expression did not shift, but she did not sit. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, her dark eyes studying Miss Marple with careful calculation. "You're waiting for someone?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no, quite the opposite. I was expecting you." The woman's fingers twitched at her sides just barely. But Miss Marple saw it, the faintest crack in her careful veneer. "I see," Eleanor murmured, smoothing her dress. "And why, pray tell, would you be expecting me?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Because, my dear, you have been most dreadfully busy, haven't you?" Eleanor did not reply. "You helped Harrington cover up Lillian's murder," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, almost conversational. "Not for love, nor for loyalty, but for power. You understood that if the truth ever surfaced, everything you had built alongside him would crumble. Your fortune, your reputation, your empire, all reliant on the silence of a dead woman." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. Miss Marple sighed softly. "But silence does not last forever, does it?" A flicker of something crossed Eleanor's face. "Mr. Radley found the letter," Miss Marple said, "and suddenly the past you had so carefully buried threatened to rise again. You couldn't allow that. So, you killed him." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. "It was quick, I imagine," Miss Marple mused. "A methodical death, perhaps a staged accident. You are a woman of efficiency, Mrs. Blackwood, and then of course there was Harrington himself, your partner, A man who had once been indispensable but had become a liability. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "You poisoned him," Miss Marple said simply, "not out of hatred but necessity. You needed to ensure that the past would die with him." Silence. Then, after a long moment, Eleanor exhaled slowly. "You're very clever, Miss Marple," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "But I fail to see how you could possibly prove such a theory." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but I don't need to prove it." Eleanor's brow creased just slightly. "You see," Miss Marple said, adjusting her shawl, "I merely needed you to come here, tonight, to see if you would run." Eleanor's expression hardened. And then, from the hallway, heavy footsteps. Finch and Graves stepped into view, flanking the doorway. Eleanor took a sharp breath. "You told yourself you wouldn't panic," Miss Marple continued, "that you would remain composed, no matter what. But you came here tonight prepared, didn't you? You suspected the walls were closing in, and you came to see if you still had a way out. That was the mistake, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor's jaw tensed, her breath quickening. Then, in an instant, she moved. She turned on her heel, making a dash for the corridor, but Graves was faster. He caught her wrist, twisting it sharply. A small, gleaming object clattered to the floor. A slender knife. The moment stretched, heavy, before Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze. And then, for the first time, Miss Marple saw it. The unfiltered truth behind Eleanor's dark eyes. Not desperation, not fear, rage. "You think you've won," Eleanor whispered. Miss Marple held her gaze. "No, my dear, I think it's over." Eleanor's shoulders rose and fell with a shuddering breath, and then at last the fight drained from her. She let Graves take her hands, let the weight of her crimes settle over her. Finch exhaled, shaking his head. "A woman like you," he murmured. "You could have had anything, and yet you chose this." Eleanor's lips curved, but there was no joy in it. "No," she said, "I simply chose to survive." Miss Marple watched as they led Eleanor away, the final echoes of her footsteps fading into the night. Then, at last, the house fell silent once more. As the door closed behind Eleanor Blackwood, the oppressive weight of the case seemed to lift. From Blackthorn Inn. Finch exhaled, rubbing his temples, and Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, one of quiet admiration. The storm had passed. Or so it seemed. The air still carried the scent of dying embers from the fireplace, and the grandfather clock in the drawing-room ticked on, its steady rhythm the only sound in the house. Miss Marple remained seated, hands folded, her expression serene yet pensive. Something was not right. It was not the case itself. The evidence against Eleanor was damning, and her reaction had sealed her fate. No, it was something else, something elusive, a faint whisper in the back of her mind. She had caught a thread of it, but it slipped away before she could grasp it fully. Finch turned to her. "I must say, Miss Marple, you handled that brilliantly. We've got our culprit and the case is closed. Now perhaps we can finally get some rest." Miss Marple blinked. Then she smiled, polite, measured. "Yes," she murmured. "Perhaps." And yet, as Finch and Graves spoke in low tones, she allowed her mind to wander back over the details. The timeline, the motives, the killings. Eleanor had orchestrated much, that was certain. But Miss Marple was not a woman to be satisfied with mere certainty. She sought clarity, and then it struck her. a seemingly insignificant detail, so small that it had nearly slipped her notice entirely. She rose abruptly, startling the two men. "Miss Marple?" Finch frowned. She turned, eyes sharper than before. "Mr. Graves, when did you first see the letter, the one Radley found?" Graves blinked. "Why, after we retrieved it from his room, of course. It was among his things tucked into a book." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "And you are certain it was in his possession the entire time?" Finch exchanged a glance with Graves, confused. "Well, yes. Where else would it have been?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward the fireplace, where the last embers smouldered, and studied the dying glow with thoughtful intensity. "Lillian Blackwood's letter," she murmured, almost to herself. "The catalyst for everything. Radley discovered it, and sought to use it. Eleanor killed him to keep it buried, and yet—" She turned back, her expression unreadable. "Who put it in Radley's hands?" Silence. Finch furrowed his brow. "What do you mean? He found it among Lillian's old belongings, didn't he?" "Did he?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but insistent. "Or was it given to him?" The thought hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Graves straightened. "You're suggesting—" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted delicately, "that Eleanor Blackwood was not the only one manipulating events." Finch's frown deepened. "But who else would benefit from exposing that letter?" Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze falling on the darkened hallway beyond the drawing-room, and then from the shadows, a soft clink of glass against wood. Dr. Howard. He stood in the doorway, a tumbler of brandy in his hand, his normally composed expression just slightly too neutral. His eyes flicked to Miss Marple's, measuring, assessing. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly. "Still playing the detective, I see." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Dr. Howard, I wonder, did you imagine that with Eleanor arrested, you would be safe?" His fingers tightened imperceptibly around the glass. Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Doctor, what's she talking about?" Howard exhaled, placing his brandy on the nearby table with meticulous care. "I should think that would be obvious, Inspector. Our dear Miss Marple has come to suspect me." Finch scoffed. "That's absurd." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not at all. In fact, it is the only explanation that makes perfect sense." She turned fully to Howard now, her sharp eyes holding his. "Eleanor Blackwood had every reason to suppress that letter, but someone else had a reason to reveal it." Howard gave a slow, knowing smile. "And you believe that was me?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer. "Yes." Finch and Graves both stiffened. Howard chuckled, shaking his head. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Marple. But tell me, what would I stand to gain?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "That is the most interesting part of all, isn't it? You had much to gain. A chance to topple Eleanor from her throne, to eliminate Harrington as a loose end, but more importantly, you had something to lose, didn't you?" Howard's smile did not falter, but something in his posture shifted. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Lillian's letter, it spoke of a man, did it not? A man she once trusted, who betrayed her in the end." Howard's fingers twitched. Miss Marple's voice softened. "That man was you." The words settled like stones in the air. Finch and Graves both turned toward Howard, disbelief etched into their features. Howard exhaled, slow and deliberate. And then for the first time, his carefully constructed facade cracked, just slightly. "A shame," he murmured. "You really are quite remarkable, Miss Marple." He reached for his brandy, and Graves moved. In an instant he was upon Howard, gripping his wrist, twisting it sharply. The glass shattered against the table, amber liquid spilling onto the floor. Howard did not fight. He simply let out a quiet chuckle. "Well," he mused, "I suppose that's that, then." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, then sighed softly. "The case was never about power," she murmured, "nor wealth. It was about a secret, a truth buried for decades." Howard smiled wryly. "Some secrets should remain buried, Miss Marple." Her gaze did not waver. "Perhaps, but not this one." The room fell silent once more, and at last the true mastermind had been unmasked. A hush settled over the drawing room, thick with the weight of revelation. The truth lay bare, fragile yet undeniable, and for the first time Dr. Howard no longer wore the mask of amused detachment. His carefully maintained composure had fractured, just enough for Miss Marple to see what lay beneath: resignation and perhaps just a glimmer of something else: relief. Finch recovered first, clearing his throat as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Dr. Howard, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and—" Howard let out a low chuckle, raising his hand slightly. "Oh, spare me the recital, Inspector. You have what you need, don't you?" Miss Marple watched him carefully, the last pieces of the puzzle still slotting into place in her mind. There was something else, one final thread to tug. She turned to Graves. "Inspector, the letter. You still have it, yes?" Graves nodded, retrieving the aged paper from his coat pocket. It had passed through too many hands, nearly vanished from existence, yet here it was, the catalyst for everything. Miss Marple took it gently, unfolding it with the utmost care. Her eyes skimmed the words, even though she already knew them by heart. "There is only one person I ever truly feared, and if something happens to me, it will be because of him. Not Eleanor, not Radley, but Howard." A deep silence settled in the room. Howard's smirk returned, though it no longer carried the same weight. "Ah," he murmured, "so she really did write it down." Finch bristled. "That's all you have to say?" Howard exhaled. "Lillian was always too smart for her own good, but so was I." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Smart enough to manipulate this entire case from the shadows." Howard turned his gaze to her, eyes sharp as a scalpel. "If I had been truly smart, Miss Marple, I would have left well enough alone." It was an admission in its own way. Graves stepped forward. But before he could reach for Howard, the doctor moved. A blur of motion, a hand dipping into his waistcoat pocket. Finch cursed, reaching for his revolver, but Miss Marple spoke first. "Stop." The command, gentle yet firm, froze them all. Even Howard hesitated. He withdrew the object from his pocket, a small glass vial. Finch's grip on his weapon tightened. "What is that?" Howard rolled the vial between his fingers. "A contingency plan." Miss Marple did not move. "Cyanide?" Howard smiled, a ghost of the confidence he once carried. "You know me too well, Miss Marple." She met his gaze. "I do." The room felt impossibly still. For a long moment no one spoke, no one moved. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, Howard placed the vial on the mantelpiece. I suppose I was never going to win this game, he mused. Finch wasted no time seizing his arm and locking the handcuffs around his wrists. You're coming with us. Howard did not resist. He only looked to Miss Marple, an odd glint in his eye. You really are remarkable. Miss Marple folded her hands. And you, Dr. Howard, were always just a little too sure of yourself. He let out a quiet chuckle. That, Miss Marple, I cannot deny. The ordeal was over. Justice, as it were, had been served. And yet, as Howard was led away, Miss Marple could not ignore the feeling that something still lingered, some echo of the past that refused to be silenced. Lillian Blackwood's voice, from beyond the grave, whispering of a fear that had finally been put to rest. Miss Marple exhaled softly, turning toward the window, where the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The case was closed, but the past never truly faded. As the sun cast its first golden rays over Blackthorn Inn, Miss Marple stood at the window watching the constables lead Dr. Howard toward the waiting car. The frost-laced air carried the distant hum of morning life stirring in the village, but inside, the quiet remained absolute. The room still bore the tension of what had unfolded, an air of finality, yet something unsettled lingered. Graves exhaled, rubbing his temples. It should feel like a victory, he muttered. We have the man, the motive, and the confession in all but name. Yet I can't shake the feeling there's something we've missed. Miss Marple, ever composed, adjusted the delicate lace of her cuffs. The mind often clings to unanswered questions, Inspector. It is our nature, Finch scoffed. If you ask me, it's done. Howard's clever, but not clever enough to wriggle out of this one. The courts will see to that. Yet Miss Marple was not so sure. She turned her gaze back to the room, taking in the details once more. The embers in the hearth had burned low, a reminder of a long night spent unravelling deceit. On the writing desk, Howard's untouched brandy remained, the liquid unmoving, as still as the room itself. Then, her eyes fell upon something small but distinct. A folded piece of paper, half tucked beneath the blotter. Had it been there before? Curiosity flickered. She stepped forward, lifting the page carefully. The handwriting was precise, meticulous. The same measured hand that had once scrawled medical prescriptions with unwavering steadiness. My dear Miss Marple, as you have no doubt deduced, this was never truly about Lillian Blackwood. She inhaled, sharply. The words, penned by Howard himself, were deliberate, meant for her eyes alone. She was merely the first in a long line of consequences. You saw the cracks before anyone else, and for that I commend you. But I wonder, have you looked deep enough? The past is never so easily buried. Her pulse quickened. She read on. If one must fall to protect a greater truth, so be it. But tell me, Miss Marple, do you believe in justice or in balance? You may have won the game, but the board is still set and the pieces remain. I trust you will find your way to the next move. No signature, no clear indication of what he meant. But Miss Marple felt it, a ghost of something unresolved, a thread still waiting to be pulled. Finch noticed her expression and frowned. What is it? She hesitated for only a moment before folding the paper neatly and slipping it into her pocket. Nothing of consequence, Inspector, she said lightly. Just the musings of a man unwilling to accept his own defeat. He grunted, satisfied enough. Good riddance to him, then. But as she stepped away from the desk, the weight of Howard's words settled in her mind. The game was not over. The past never truly faded. And somewhere, in the shadows of Blackthorn Inn, another secret waited to be unearthed.